Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today's discussion is going to be the last one on Dale Allison for a while. I'm not sure exactly how long. It will make use of the series on bereavement apparitions that I have just done. So you might want to familiarize yourself with that. But it will not be noting new differences between the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection appearances and bereavement apparitions. Instead, I'm going to be talking about how all of this relates to minimalism versus maximalism in the resurrection argument. And I'll be linking a blog post that I wrote several weeks ago. I'm going to be responding here specifically to a challenge, in a sense, that Dr. William Lane Craig issued a couple of weeks ago. As you'll see in that blog post, and maybe you've already read it if you follow my work on Facebook, Dr. Craig was quite critical of some remarks made by David Paulman on the resurrection of Jesus and on Dale Allison. Dr. Craig was particularly distressed that David was not emphasizing the positive. What Craig sees as this very exciting, positive set of things about Dale Allison's work on Jesus' resurrection. So he was really saying it's important that we, Christians, arguing for the resurrection of Jesus, accentuate the positive rather than focusing on the negative when we talk about Dale Allison's work. I believe this is a shift in Dr. Craig's approach to Allison, more of a rhetorical shift than anything else. But years ago, he was himself much more willing to talk about the negative with Dale Allison. And in Reasonable Faith, I was reading recently, even speculated about Dr. Allison's motives for questioning the full bodily resurrection of Jesus. But now the emphasis is, no, we need to be saying and emphasizing and talking about the fact that Dale Allison affirms the empty tomb and the appearance to the 12. That was the emphasis in Dr. Craig's recent podcast. I will also be linking that recent podcast. So briefly, his idea was, since it's so exciting that Dale Allison admits the empty tomb and the appearance to the 12, we should be talking about his arguments. I'm going to read a couple quotes from that podcast where Dr. Craig is talking to Kevin, who's kind of his foil, the person he talks with on these podcasts. And the first quote refers to the fact that Paulman had a few remarks about the raising of the saints in Allison. And it's very strange because one of the things that Dr. Craig did was to say that Paulman was putting too much of a focus on this, whereas actually it was only quite brief comparatively in what Paulman recorded, and actually it's Dale Allison who places a big focus on it. But that's what the trivial issue is here in this first sentence. Okay, this is Dr. Craig. The fact that Paulman would focus on so trivial an issue as this, when Allison has so many important things to say in this book, shows that he really doesn't have a sound grasp of the central issues. Allison's book is the most important book on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, and we should be talking about Allison's arguments for the historicity of Jesus' empty tomb and post-mortem appearances of Jesus and so forth. As you know, if you read my blog post, I really rung the changes on that. Really, the most important book on Jesus' resurrection? Isn't that a little bit over the top? This video of mine is going to take on his challenge. Oh, we need to be talking about Dale Allison's arguments. Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk about his arguments. And I'm going to show why those arguments themselves just emphasize the gulf between good argumentation concerning the resurrection and bad argumentation concerning the resurrection. So yeah, well, let's talk about his arguments. Here is something that Dr. Craig said about Allison and the empty tomb. He said, in fact, I think that Allison is too skeptical here. In my published work, I have defended a number of the arguments for the empty tomb against his criticisms. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that he does affirm the history of the empty tomb on these two grounds. Okay, so, and I'll be talking in a couple minutes here about what these two grounds are. So he kind of starts with his downplaying. Yeah, he's not really gung-ho on the empty tomb, but, again, we need to accentuate the positive, and that's his takeaway, right? All right, and then on the appearance to the 12, Dr. Craig says, so Allison does not think that we need to doubt that this post-mortem appearance to the 12 actually occurred. These are the important conclusions of his study that we really should be talking about. So, he's like lecturing us on what we should and shouldn't be talking about. I find that annoying, to put it mildly. All right, continuing. In fact, if you think about it, Kevin, just think about this for a moment. Allison's skepticism about the Matthean passage of the resurrection of the saints actually makes his affirmation of the burial story, the empty tomb, post-mortem appearance, all the more impressive, because this is coming from a man who is quite willing to admit the presence of unhistorical legend in the Gospels. End quote. Now that is classic minimalist reasoning. And this is particularly ironic because in that podcast, for some reason, Dr. Craig tried to claim the label of maximalism for his own approach. He literally said that his approach is maximalist. Now, that was a puzzle to me because I coined the word maximalist and its cognates, maximal data, maximalism, concerning the resurrection argument. And back in 2018, Dr. Craig and I actually had an exchange on this very issue in which I explained why there's a broad use of the term minimalism that encompasses more than just Gary Habermas's specific minimal facts approach, and why I consider that concept of minimalism in that broad sense to encompass Dr. Craig's approach, and in particular that he explicitly eschews the use of the reliability of the Gospels and focuses instead on a few facts that he calls core facts or central facts rather than minimal facts, and includes at least one more, namely the empty tomb, that Dr. Habermas doesn't say is a minimal fact, though he's still relying on Habermas's assertion as to how widely accepted it is, at least in reasonable faith. Dr. Craig relies on that. But the point is, I made it very clear all those years ago in 2018 how I'm using the term maximalist, which I coined, and why his approach doesn't fit with that definition, and yet for some reason here he's trying to claim that word for himself. So that's really odd. But especially in view of the fact that what he just said about Allison's relatively liberal approach to the Gospels making his affirmations more impressive is about as centrally minimalist type of an argument and rhetoric as you could want to find. So, yeah. Now, what I'm going to talk about right now are 3 assumptions of minimalism in this broader sense that are all wrong. All right. Especially with respect to the appearances of Jesus. All right, the first assumption. If a more liberal scholar than oneself admits or affirms some fact, an appearance fact specifically, that the minimalist wants to use as a premise, this must be happening against the more liberal scholar's own bias. Hence, it must indicate in the kind of a meta-level fashion that the evidence which the more liberal scholar must be relying on is overwhelming. So, such an admission should be very exciting to Christians about the strength of the evidence for this proposition. All right, in this case, the appearance to the 12. We should get really excited because the evidence must be terribly overwhelming, because here even so-and-so, in this case Dale Allison, affirms it. Well, that's what Dr. Craig is saying. That it has to be, the assumption is that it has to be taking place against Allison's bias. and therefore he must be being forced by evidence, which evidence we ourselves would also acknowledge, and then we would just take the argument further. That's how the minimalist type of approach is cast. All right, assumption 2. Any disparity between what the scholar says, the more liberal scholar, in his argument and what we are arguing for about the resurrection should be dismissed by saying that he's still somewhat too skeptical, but that this just means that what he acknowledges doesn't go all the way. His admission should still be regarded as some kind of a gain, which could, in arguing with someone who took his position, be used as a stepping stone in the right direction. Now that's very similar to what I just read from Dr. Craig, and I've seen this again and again in talking with minimalists at the popular level, laymen and so forth. They're like, well, yeah, it doesn't go all the way. They'll say this about the minimal facts argument too, but at least it gets us some part of the way. So that's the assumption, that it can't be a case of, one step forward, two steps back. Instead, the admission of the liberal scholar is an unequivocal gain. It may not be going as far as we want, but it's definitely a step in the right direction, all things considered. All right. Third assumption. There is a sharp distinction in examining the works of liberal scholars, including the one in question, between the facts, such as the appearance to the 12, and the explanation of the facts. And by describing what that liberal scholar acknowledges at a sufficiently high level of generality, we can relegate all disagreements to the realm of the explanation while still celebrating his agreement on the facts. Now, as sure as God made little green apples, somebody is going to respond to this video of mine here with number 3, at least, the assumption I just read. Well, yes, of course we disagree on the explanation, but at least these scholars agree on the facts. It is not that simple. And that's going to be a big emphasis of this whole video I'm doing here today, that constantly Dr. Allison is going back and he's curating the very premises that he's using. He's redefining the very fact of the appearance to the 12 so that it means something completely different from what Dr. Craig would mean by it, or anything that would be helpful to our case. He's actually turning it into something that would be harmful to the case for the bodily resurrection if that were really supported by the evidence. And then there's this constant dialectic that goes on back and forth, where if something in the gospel accounts would seem to indicate something stronger than a vision, which is in fact Dr. Allison's final explanation, then that part of the Gospels is thrown out and not treated as part of the data on that very ground. And it's circular. Okay, this must be apologetic because it indicates that Jesus is a body rather than an apparition. I just did a whole series on that, and you can see more details of this. So there isn't such a sharp distinction in the argumentation of this very person that Dr. Craig is celebrating between the explanation and what he admits as the data. And we'll see more examples of that today. Now, I want to disclaim something. I am not saying as some kind of, global statement, there are no neutral facts. I've often called myself a rampaging evidentialist. I am not a presuppositionalist. I am not saying that there are no neutral facts. I am not advocating some kind of soft epistemological relativism. I'm saying that, in fact, in the work of Dr. Allison and of other liberal scholars very often as well, they're not maintaining vigilance against circularity in their way of treating the data. And that's something that can be avoided, but they don't avoid it. Okay, so don't take this to be an endorsement of some kind of presuppositional idea. I remember years ago, Tim and I came upon a statement from a presuppositionalist that to the unbeliever, every apple is a God-denying apple. Really odd. if an unbeliever really does think of an apple as a God-denying apple, then he's making a mistake, and it's a mistake that he should be able to correct, even though he's an unbeliever. Now, I want to give a brief example, a couple of examples. I'm going to give two. That's part of what's going to make this video a little longer than my usual, that apply to all three of those faulty assumptions. And I'm hoping these will act as intuition pumps that will help you to see why these three assumptions are wrong. So I'm going to give a number example first. I've given this before. Suppose that you have a black box, and in that black box is a number, written on a card or something, big, clear number. The black box is closed. You then have various people come and look inside and take a peek and close it again and say what they think they saw when they looked in there. What do they believe that number is? All right? Now, let's suppose that the number, everybody's told the number can be anything from 1 to 100. So to begin with, any given number has a 1 chance in 100 of being the correct number. You have, let's say, taken a look inside, and based on your memory, you think the number is 5. And so you want to argue that the number is 5. Then you're watching these other people come along, and they're looking inside, and then they're saying what they think the number is. And so you're treating them as like experts in a sense, because they've had a chance to look in the box, and you want to see if you can gain some kind of consensus or clue or something you can celebrate from what they say. Well, their answers are kind of all over the place, but in fact, several of them say a number that happens to be less than 10, but it's a specific number. So some say 9, maybe quite a few of them say 9. A couple of them say 2, okay? And maybe 1 or 2 say 5, which is what you think the number is. So you then aggregate these and you say, well, look at what a significant result we have here, because all of these experts who looked at the box at least agree that the number is less than 10. So you're including there the people who said it was 9 and the people who said it was 2, even though they said it was something completely different from the number you're ultimately arguing for. And you say, but that it's a gain. At least they agree that it's less than 10. After all, being 1 out of 10 is much better probability that it's 5 than being 1 out of 100. So this shifts the probabilities in the direction of my conclusion, which is that the number is actually 5. But you're deliberately ignoring the fact that what they said, looked at clearly and without throwing out part of what they said, is actually evidence against the proposition that it's 5. You're erasing that and just using the broader description, less than 10. Now this is something on which there is a literature in epistemology, okay, about this very problem. And this is why in epistemology, and particularly in formal epistemology, we're told you have to conditionalize on the evidence at the most specific relevant level. And in this case, the most specific relevant level is that this number of people said it was 9, and this number of people said it was 2, and understood at that level, it's evidence against the proposition that it's 5. Now, what the minimalist is doing very often is making the mistake, the illicit move of just saying, well, he acknowledges the appearance to the 12, and saying, isn't that a gain? Doesn't that move us if we go, if we were to take what he admits, wouldn't that move us in the right direction? Ignoring the fact that what the person means by the appearance to the 12 is something that would actually take us away from the bodily resurrection. All right, I'm going to give one other sort of intuition pump example. Suppose you have 2 reports that a lion has been seen in your neighborhood by two different men, and they both say they saw a lion. They even talk about his mane and hearing him roar, and they were only 5 feet away from him and saw him, and then turned around and ran, and don't know how they got away with their lives, etc. Okay, so they give attestations, reports, which may or may not be true. They could just be lying, of lion-like experiences, distinctively lion-like experiences, a size that is what we would expect from a male lion, a mane that no other kind of animal has, a roaring sound that is similar to what we would hear if we were at the zoo and heard a lion roaring, etc. Okay? So we have reports of distinctively lion-like experiences. Along comes someone who's skeptical about there actually being a lion in the neighborhood, and he says, I think that at some point, very early after the experience, the event, whatever it might have been, something to do with bias, pro-lion bias, crept in here, and the stories that they're telling are not really reflecting what they experienced. But I believe that these men experienced something. They did have an appearance experience. But I think that what they really experienced, which has left no trace in the reports that we have, is that they saw a dog. And I think their experiences were dog-like experiences. It may have been a somewhat large dog, but not anything like what they actually describe, which wouldn't be what we would expect from a dog at all, okay? But I affirm that they had an animal appearance experience. Now, it would be completely confused to come along and say, well, let's celebrate this. What we should be talking about is that what this person has acknowledged is the appearance to the two. All right, these two men who are reporting having seen a lion. He acknowledges the appearance to the two. All right, but then ignoring the fact that what he means by the appearance is a completely different phenomenology. It's not just that he thinks that the explanation was different, that they actually experienced a dog and somehow turned it into a lion in their report. He thinks that actually what they experienced was a dog-like experience, and that's what he means when he talks about the appearance. And so there's really no agreement to celebrate here, because this person has literally changed the very phenomenology that you're trying to assert when you say, well, at least, they had this appearance experience. Now, what's the best explanation? Well, the best explanation of the experience that he thinks that they had would be a dog, because he's retconned the experience type, the very nature of the experience, so that it's dog-like. Well, if you have a dog-like experience, the best explanation is a dog. Okay, so there's not any overlap here really to be celebrating, because you're talking about different appearance experiences, and that's very close to what's happening in the case of Dale Allison. All right, now we're going to see today that when we examine Allison's arguments and reasons for these facts, very often they undermine the bodily resurrection, or would, if they were good arguments, undermine the bodily resurrection of Jesus, while if they were true and if they were good arguments, leading to the conclusion, no surprise, that is Dale Allison's actual conclusion. So he's not arguing against bias. He's not being forced by the evidence against bias. On the contrary, he's curating and changing the evidence in such a way that it supports the conclusion that he leans toward. And let's remember again that the appearance to the 12 in Dr. Craig's own central facts or core facts or moderate facts, people have different words for this argument, is a premise. The appearance to the 12 is not the conclusion. When Dr. Craig talks about it, it's that they had a group experience, that the 12 had a group appearance experience. And that's not circular or anything. I'm not claiming that Dr. Craig is being circular. I'm just pointing out that when we talk about Allison's arguments for an appearance to the 12, we're not even getting all the way to the interpretation. We're talking about his arguments that they had a certain phenomenological experience. Okay, so once again, this doesn't fall into this, well, he disagrees with us about the ultimate interpretation, but at least he agrees with the facts. No, he is affirming a different thing as a fact at the exact point where Dr. Craig is affirming something as a fact on which then he's going to base his inference to the best explanation, namely the appearance to the 12. That is supposed to be a premise. All right. Now, it's such a perfect illustration, something that Allison does about the empty tomb, that even though I'm mostly going to be talking about the appearance to the 12, I want to get this in here. And what's really striking is that Dr. Craig actually read this passage on his podcast, and it didn't seem to occur to him, wait a minute, one of those arguments for the empty tomb is an argument that, if adopted, would actually undermine the conclusion that Jesus really rose from the dead. It would actually weaken the argument for that conclusion. So, okay, we need to be talking about his arguments. Let's talk about his arguments. And once we see that his arguments are poor arguments, even for his own conclusions, and also that they're arguments that, if they worked, would undermine the conclusion we're going for, we should stop with this whole narrative that, wow, it's so impressive. The evidence was so strong that it forced him to, because the evidence he's using is evidence that isn't strong for the ultimate conclusion that I think is the correct conclusion from the real evidence, the real argument. All right. So here's Allison concerning the empty tomb. The two best arguments for the tradition, that is, of the empty tomb, are concrete and evidential. A, the short, enigmatic story in Mark 16, 1-8, which invited so much revision and expansion, looks like a memory Christians sought to upgrade. And B, the involvement of Mary Magdalene and other women commends itself as nonfiction. So B is just a criterion of embarrassment, that it's the women supposedly first found the empty tomb. And, as far as that goes, I'm not going to quarrel with that argument. I don't think it's as strong as some people think it is, but that's fine. I mean, that's an argument one could adopt. But A, which is one of his two strongest, is specifically that the story of the discovery of the empty tomb in Mark 16, 1-8, is, in his view, embellished in other Gospels. In fact, one of his statements about an embellishment concerns an actual appearance to the women. He considers it an embellishment in Matthew of the empty tomb story in Mark, namely that the women are able to grasp Jesus' feet. That occurs in Matthew. So he's using as an argument that the tomb really was found empty the alleged fact that Christians made up stuff, false stuff that was not true, that they had no qualms about making this up, that it made it into the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to try to upgrade the story of the empty tomb. That's an argument for the empty tomb. That's crazy. All right, I mean, it's particularly crazy, if I may say, if not pathetic, for someone who's actually arguing for the empty tomb in a strong fashion to be all excited about an argument that depends so importantly. This is one of what Allison claims is one of the two strongest arguments for the empty tomb on something that if it were true, would undermine the entire argument for the resurrection. It would be a very negative blow if we just were like, yeah, Matthew totally made up that thing about the women grasping Jesus' feet, or somebody made it up, and knowing it wasn't true, and Matthew just uncritically included it. That's a terrible argument for the resurrection. So it's like these poison pills are being implanted in the argument, which if we get all enthusiastic about it, what are we going to say about those? And if you take those away, Allison's not going to affirm the empty tomb probably anyway. Like if you said, no, you can't use that one. You can only use the criterion of embarrassment. Well, he barely affirms the empty tomb as it is. He's like, thinks it's just more probable than not. Maybe not. Maybe he'd still affirm it. Maybe he wouldn't. But you can't you can't make a big deal about his arguments and how the arguments must have forced him against his bias, and therefore this is something to celebrate, when one of the arguments is actually contrary to the conclusion of the resurrection, which is supposedly what's in view. Now, I also think this is just false. I don't think the other gospel writers or their human sources just made this other stuff up. I don't think that Mark 16, 1 through 8, taken in conjunction with the other gospels, looks like a memory Christians sought to upgrade. I think that's just wrong. And I think we have much better arguments for Jesus' resurrection, which use the testimony of the women. I tend not to break out the empty tomb as a fact in its own right. I tend to use as a premise, well, these women testified, thus. They at least claimed that these things happened, and then talk about the angels and the empty tomb and so forth as the content of what they claimed, and then among other claims look at what is the best explanation for that inter alia. And once again, this is not circular on the part of the maximalist, because for them to claim that does not entail that Jesus really rose, and is actually a fairly modest premise that this is what they claimed, even though it's rejected by many New Testament scholars. All right. Now let's move on to the appearance to the 12, which is where we're really going. All right. Concerning the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, Allison answers an objection that they didn't have ocular experiences, and that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't actually refer to, or so-called creed that Paul gives, his list of he appeared to, doesn't actually refer to visual experiences. Now, this might seem like a win-win. It's like, yeah, we think they had visual experiences, and Allison thinks they had visual experiences. Hey, maybe he doesn't go all the way, but let's celebrate this agreement, and he's got arguments for this, that they had visual experiences. Well, cool. Let's use those. So let's see what some of those arguments are. Okay. Here's a quote. Curtailing the important role of visions within early Christian circles would be imprudent. The earliest Christian writer, Paul, was a visionary. The first narrative of the early Christian movement, Acts, attributes multiple visions to Jesus' followers and cites Joel 2:28 as programmatic. Your young men shall see visions. There is, given the religious enthusiasm of the early Jesus movement and the number of visionary experiences in the New Testament, no cause to balk at the meaning that commentators have almost unanimously lent to ophthe, saw, over the course of 2,000 years. That's on page 43. Then on page 337, he's even more explicit. While the stories in the Gospels grew in the telling and contained late and legendary elements, their correlations with countless reports of visionary experiences from other times and places, as unfolded in part 3, establish with decent probability that they reflect or echo some genuine experiences. Again, however, we should not lose sight of how little we know. Page 337. So let's get this clear. All right, what is he doing? He's arguing in part inductively that it doesn't have a very low prior probability that the disciples had ocular, visual experiences, from the fact that he considers it pretty frequent that enthusiastic religious people have ocular visual experiences. All right, so that raises the prior, and he's very, very explicit about this. But that inductive case to raise the prior is based on an analogy that he wishes to make between the experiences that they actually had and visions, as opposed to bodily type experiences. And again, I'm still just talking about the phenomenology here. I'm not talking about the explanation. At the level of phenomenology, Allison is making a sort of a convergence where he's downplaying the evidence in the Gospels for their having very strongly bodily group phenomenology, in a group, having meals with Jesus. No, they didn't really claim that, and that isn't really what their experiences were like. And then bringing in the frequency of visionary claims, and he thinks actual, vision type experiences, however one explains them, within religion and even within Christianity. So hey, why does he affirm the appearance to the 12? Well, he affirms an appearance to the 12, which was phenomenologically, in his view, vision-like in character. And part of the reason he affirms this is because he doesn't think it was like what's described in the Gospels, and therefore he doesn't think that it's all that improbable to begin with. Now, that's not something we can build on to argue for the bodily resurrection. The very inductive case for this higher prior, if accepted as an analogy to what they experienced, would tend to be evidence against the bodily resurrection. This is something I'm always saying. There would be experiences that they could have, even in a group, which would be evidence against the bodily resurrection, particularly if we also add as part of the the set of evidence, that they did not have these more robust bodily-like experiences as described in the Gospels, that these vision-like phenomenological experiences were instead of those, which is exactly what Allison thinks. Well then, if you only have, you're there as a group, and several of you think that you see Jesus, we actually talked about this in the last video. Allison's like, well, for all we know, we can't tell, maybe only a few of them actually saw him, or thought they saw him when the 12 were together, and the others just went along, can't tell. So a few of them see him, and they're like, oh my goodness, that's Jesus over there in the corner. And then he speaks only very briefly. We've gone into that, right? He certainly doesn't offer to demonstrate and let them touch him and eat and all that kind of thing, It's a brief encounter. It's only one. We'll be seeing Allison emphasizing that. It's the only group experience of the 12, or a group that would be called the 12. It might have been 11 or they might have been 10, but that's the only one that happens. That E is actually better explained by some kind of paranormal metaphysics than by a bodily resurrection. So we should be talking about Dale Allison's arguments. Yes, we should. And that talking about should show us why these arguments are not actually forcing him against his bias, and why these arguments are poor, and also why these arguments are not anything that could be built upon or used as a stepping stone. All right. Similarly, he starts to use some kind of multiple attestation as an argument for an appearance to the 12, which is, I keep using scare quotes if you're listening to this on the podcast version, the appearance, an appearance. I'm using scare quotes because it doesn't mean the same thing. All right. right, here are a couple passages which hint at multiple attestation. Paul is not so far removed from the gospel traditions as many have supposed. If, furthermore, the appearances to the 500 and to James were, as seems likely, post-Pentecostal, well, there's an assumption. I mean, why? Anyway, he's got a very poor argument that those were after Pentecost. And so, beyond the purview of the gospel narratives, and if, as I will urge, all the apostles, that's in 1 Corinthians 15, adverts not to a single event, but is instead Paul's blanket summary, and if, as many have sensibly surmised, lists the reference to the appearance in Matthew, in the long ending of Mark, in Luke, the appearance to the 11, and in John 20, the first appearance to the male disciples, descend from the same proto-commissioning, the agreements are all the greater. Page 44. That series of ifs is just amusing. You know, if we change what appears to be the meaning or a prima facie interpretation of what Paul is saying, and then if we assimilate all of these accounts in the Gospels, even where they appear to be definitely of different appearance experiences to a single experience, then we have, look at all the attestations we have between Paul and the Gospels to the appearance to the 12, and it's not so different from Paul's list. Now, I don't actually think there's any contradiction between the Gospels and Paul's list. I mean, that you don't need to massage Paul's list in these ways to make them similar, but it's an example of a bad argument, which is sort of taking a bunch of passages and putting them all in one basket and claiming they're to the same thing, and then saying, look at all the attestations we have to that thing. All right, so similar. Here's a quotation where he appears to be using multiple attestation for the appearance to the 12. On page 60 and following, despite what Marcus Bockmuehl has called the narrative mayhem of the resurrection stories, the accounts in, and he gives those references again in Matthew, Luke, John, and the long ending of Mark, exhibit the same basic structure: setting, appearance, doubt, commissioning, promise of support. There is also some overlap in vocabulary, the most notable items being these: 11, see, believe, disbelief, unbelief, unbelieving, name, all the nations, all the world, Father, speak, with Jesus as the subject. By the way, these are not really all that exciting as similarities. I mean, even on multiple occasions, Jesus might have used similar vocabulary. The four accounts are, given the parallels, likely developments of the same proto-commissioning. That Paul lists only one appearance to the 12 is consistent with the several accounts having a common single ancestor. Notice that the only way you're going to get Paul listing only one appearance to the 12 is if Paul's reference to all the apostles is not to a separate appearance to the 12. So we're already modifying the meaning of Paul. Can we retrieve any historical tidbits from the varied versions of the appearance to the 12? It is then reasonable to infer, and I am inclined to believe, that these three motifs, doubt, consolation, mission, derive from the original experience. Yet one must acknowledge that mission, consolation, and doubt are standard fare in Hebrew Bible call narratives. Convincingly coaxing historical details out of the stories of Jesus appearing to the 12 is no easy task. What is more, we cannot even be sure where the event occurred. Mark and Matthew direct us to Galilee, Luke and John to Jerusalem. So he's going to say that when Mark and Matthew mention Galilee and Luke and John mention Jerusalem, and Mark, by the way, mentions Galilee in the words of the angel before any actual appearance, but the angel says he's going before into Galilee. All right, so he takes this to be a contradiction, referring to the same appearance, not that there were appearances both in Jerusalem and in Galilee. That's a harmonization which he rejects. But the point is, now we have allegedly multiple attestation. All right, he's very skeptical about going back to eyewitnesses. In fact, in a footnote to the very passage I just read, he disagrees with William Lane Craig by name concerning the role of the beloved disciple. Footnote 119. According to William Lane Craig, quote, behind the Johannine account stands the witness of the beloved disciple, one of the 12, which serves as a guarantee of the fundamental accuracy of the traditions of the event, unquote, from Craig. Continue quote from Allison. This is far too easy, says Allison. While I agree with Craig that the beloved disciple was a historical figure, his authorship of John is not a given. If the beloved disciple was not the author, we do not know to what extent the gospel reproduces his direct testimony. Human memory is not a constant. Some have much better memories than others, and we have no way of evaluating the accuracy of the beloved disciple's recall. Actually, we do have ways, I wish to add here, of evaluating the beloved disciple's recall. Amazing amount of evidence, both internal and external, for the reliability of John. Okay, continue with Allison. Eyewitnesses can do things other than remember. Plato's use of Socrates suffice to establish that. As we all know from experience, some people, when telling stories, love to embellish and exaggerate. How can anyone know that the beloved disciple was not among their number? Oh, I'm glad you asked, Dale. I wrote a whole book on that. Several books. All right, so basically he's just throwing shade, as they say, on the whole idea that the account in John, and accounts plural, of appearances to the disciples go back to eyewitness testimony from someone who is conscientious about not just making stuff up. So what's really interesting here is he seems to be using multiple attestation to support that, some kind of appearance happened, a proto-commissioning as he calls it. But he doesn't realize what I've emphasized many times on this channel before, which is that multiple embellishment is not multiple attestation. Whatever tradition lies behind these accounts, in his view, it is lost to us forever. We don't have an account which actually tells us what the original witnesses were claiming, and he's just cast doubt on their honesty anyway. Maybe they're embellishing already by the time they gave the original account. And all the differences that might point either to multiple occurrences, as in the case of Galilee versus Jerusalem, or to multiple persons actually giving accounts, persons who had some awareness of some, what originally happened, such as, for example, that Jesus eats in Luke 24 in probably, I would say, in this case, the same experience as the first one in John 20, but John doesn't mention the eating, so that's a variation that I think points to different sources of information for Luke's and John, sources of information, all right, that at least have a claim to go back to the original events. Instead, what we have are multiple just making stuff up, embellishments, variations on an original theme, and that original theme, in Allison's view, was an experience that was completely unlike these accounts. That's not good multiple attestation. That's not a good argument. It's not even a good argument for what he affirms. I want to emphasize that. It's not a good argument that there must have been some, actual experience that goes back to it. It would be like if you had 4 movies in all of which Robin Hood wins an archery contest. And the movies, were literally quite different. In maybe one movie is a dark reflection on social injustice, and the other movie has the classic romance between Maid Marian and Robin Hood, and another movie is transgressive and has Maid Marian being trans or whatever, right? We got 5 different movie versions, but they're all just movies. And the fact that they all contain the archery contest story is no argument at all that there actually was a guy named Robin Hood and that he won an archery contest. That's where we're at. This is a terrible argument that there must or probably was an appearance to the 12 that, they actually were together, and at least some of them, when they were together, actually had an ocular vision type experience. It's not even a good argument for that. All right, so we certainly can't follow this strategy because it's not a good argumentative strategy. It's inaccurate as a type of argument. It's epistemically wrong. And he's also downplaying what would be more interesting, which would be some of these accounts going back to witness testimony from somebody who has scruples about just lying. Totally downplays that. Well, that's where we could actually get a stronger argument going here, okay? But no, he's not going to accept that. I'm talking about his arguments, just as Dr. Craig said that we should. All right. Moreover, he's reducing the number of appearances from the prima facie number of appearances if we look at the gospel accounts. Now that's important because the variety and number of claimed, again, in a maximalist account you say this is what they claimed appearance experiences is part of the evidence for a bodily resurrection, that he's appearing, in different places, inside and outside, and he appears bodily in, various ways. They claimed he appeared bodily in various ways in these different situations, okay? Jerusalem, Galilee, different, partially overlapping, partially non-overlapping groupings, and so forth. Allison acknowledges this point himself, namely that reducing the number of appearances strengthens his case for a ultimately metaphysically visionary experience, and intermediately, as we're going through the premise, a visionary type phenomenology. And he acknowledges this when he's talking about Jake O'Connell. So Jake O'Connell wrote a book arguing that Jesus' appearances were not apparitions, arguing against the apparition literature. I want to say right here, I haven't been able to get a hold of Jake O'Connell. I tried a few years ago. He had emailed me when his book was in dissertation form, if I recall, and sent me some chapters, and I had some criticisms of the probability theory. I haven't looked up recently what they were, and I've never looked to see whether he changed those parts. But anyway, he got in touch with me quite a number of years ago. And I remember something that I said at the time that I now want to take back. So, Dr. O'Connell, if you're watching this, I'm correcting something I said. I said, nobody, it's just Dale Allison, he's just one guy, nobody's really trying to say that these were apparitions. I mean, skeptics don't believe in real ghosts anyway, etc. Why are you doing your dissertation on this topic, basically? I thought he was in some ways focusing too much on something that isn't sufficiently mainstream. Well, I was wrong about that. It's not that there's a wide number of skeptics who also believe in the paranormal. Allison's kind of unusual there, but that his arguments are very influential, even if a more skeptical person would take them to indicate something psychological rather than something veridically paranormal. But either way, his forms of argument and his attempt to make analogies to bereavement apparitions are actually not uncommon at all, and his position as a widely well thought of and respected New Testament scholar is also important to how influential these apparition theories are. So I shouldn't have tried to discourage Jake O'Connell from writing on that topic, and I didn't in the end. He did write a book on that topic. All right, so O'Connell is in view a lot in this 2021 book by Dale Allison. So Allison is talking about his own analogy to apparitions. In the main text on page 80, oh, sorry, in the main text on page 256, he asks, does the literature on apparitions offer any analogies, however imperfect, to the New Testament series as a whole? Now, as you've seen, if you've been listening to or watching my previous series, he doesn't really think the analogies are all that imperfect. The phrase, however imperfect, there is a fudge factor, but given the extent to which he throws out any evidence that, and just says, well, but that's late after all, and then says, so it fits with what we find. Well, it doesn't really fit with what we find. It fits with what we would find if we threw out the parts of the Gospels that I think were added later. Okay, given the extent to which he does that, he ends up making the analogy pretty perfect by, changing the evidence. All right, but that's what he says in the main text. Does the literature on apparitions offer any analogies to the New Testament series as a whole? And then he has a footnote. For a negative answer, see O'Connor. Now, it took me a little while to figure out. You can tell from the rest of the footnote that that's just a misprint, just a typo for O'Connell. I'm not making a big thing about that, but if you're trying to look this up in the book, he actually says O'Connor at the beginning of the footnote and then later changes it in the footnote to O'Connell. For several reasons, I have a different view. So Allison has a different view from O'Connell's negative answer to the statement about Jesus and apparition experiences. I take the canonical sources to be further from pristine memory than he does, which makes it easier to account for some of the slippage between them and other stories. Other stories, meaning stories of apparitions. Yes, indeed. If you just say, oh, this isn't what anybody really close to the facts claimed, it accounts for. It allows you to make an analogy more closely between the apparition literature and the claims. Unlike O'Connor, I accept the authenticity of the Bull case. I'm not going to go into details about the Bull case, but that was one where a group of this guy's family apparently had a visual experience. Doesn't seem like they had even claimed a tactile experience. I think that maybe they were lying. O'Connell thinks they were lying, etc. Allison thinks they weren't, but it wasn't very analogous to the strongly bodily type experiences recorded in the Gospels anyway. All right, and then listen to this. The number of occasions on which Jesus appeared to more than one individual is less for me than for O'Connell. I regard several of the canonical stories as variants of the single appearance to the 12. See pages 60 to 64. We've just been reading from Allison, pages 60 to 64. And I suspect that he appeared to all the apostles, that's in 1 Corinthians 15, adverts not to a single event, but is Paul's generalizing summary. All right, so he's very explicit. Why does he think that the analogy is greater between the gospel stories and the series as a whole, as he puts it, and the apparition literature? Well, because he throws out parts of the series as a whole. He tells you that because he thinks they're further from pristine memory, even though, as we've seen, he has no non-question begging reason to throw them out, and because he thinks there were fewer experiences, because he's collapsed the Galilee and Jerusalem experiences into one another. And of course, he thinks the Doubting Thomas thing is entirely made up, not a separate experience of the 12. So his argument for the appearance to the 12, as he uses it, is based on a deliberate use of arguments that undermine the physicality of Jesus' resurrection. So it's a one step forward, two steps back type of argument. Oh, yay, he acknowledges an appearance to the 12. Oh, wait, It's a very different kind of appearance from anything that would support a bodily resurrection, and the arguments for it are such as, if they were good arguments, would argue against a bodily appearance and a bodily resurrection. So I've taken up William Lane Craig's challenge that we should be talking about Allison's arguments. I've shown how the entire minimalist approach, which Pache Craig, his core facts or central facts argument is a version of, encourages us to make epistemic mistakes, especially equivocation on the very meaning of one of these core facts of the appearance. And I've shown how a liberal scholar, who minimalists want to applaud as making significant concessions against his own bias, thus testifying to the strength of the underlying arguments, is doing nothing of the kind. He's using a redefined fact, then making poor arguments for that redefined fact, arguments which cater directly to his own biases, and which, if they were good, would undermine the ultimate conclusion of the bodily resurrection. This is not something that can be shunted aside or brushed off by saying, of course, he has a different interpretation, but it's still exciting that he acknowledges the fact of the appearance to the 12. So this is one of the things that's wrong with minimalism, and this is one of the reasons why you should come over to the maximal side and argue in a very different way. Namely, you should argue for gospel reliability, be prepared to do that, be prepared to go up against scholars who think otherwise. Then you should take that to mean that at least the Gospels and Acts tell us what they claimed, what the alleged witnesses claimed, and under what circumstances, as in Acts, under what circumstances of persecution and danger and so forth. Who claimed what when, in other words, which is not a miracle, it's not question begging, but it does go contrary to liberal scholarship, and I think we can argue overwhelmingly strongly against liberal scholarship at exactly that point in an evidential way. And then argue that the best explanation of their making those claims under those circumstances is that Jesus indeed rose bodily from the dead. That, in a nutshell, is the maximalist approach. And it differs fundamentally from the minimalist approach, which is why, if we're talking about Dr. Allison's arguments, we're usually going to be talking about what's wrong with them, not about what's right with them. Okay, come back next time for whatever I decide to do next here on the Lydia Muguru channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.